From populations, we move to communities. Again, a community is when we have multiple populations of different species together. So, as an example, this log here, two things. One, by falling down, this tree is no longer creating shade over the area, and it may even knock some other things down. So when a tree falls in the forest, whether or not anybody hears it, it makes an opening where other plants can grow. And the log itself, as it decays, can provide a good spot for seeds to get going, and so you often see a variety of things growing on the old log itself. For that matter, if not everything died, you might even get some sprouting of a bit coming from the log itself. So we can see various types of plants growing on this log, and they're all together, they are interacting with each other. Different types, so it's a community. So communities, multiple populations, different species that are physically interacting in some degree. They're in the same place and time. Now, as we saw for populations, what counts as one place is somewhat problematic. You have bigger and smaller communities that you can look at. That log, the things on and near it would be a community, but also the whole forest. You have different types of trees in the forest, and there is interaction among them. Community, when we add in non-living factors, the abiotic components, that makes an ecosystem. Lots of things that we might ask about as we're studying a community. What's there? What are the populations? So how many different types of species might there be? What species are they? What sort of environmental roles do they have? How many of them? Do we have similar numbers of quite a lot of things? Pretty even? Or is our community almost all one thing, but it's a couple of things present there? Different styles of community there. What happens when some disturbance comes along to affect our community? Is it pretty stable? Does it collapse easily in some other community forms? There are many possibilities. As with even individual cells or parts of cells, all the way up through our whole organisms and populations, we can look at energy and nutrients, how they're going through the community. We might have a food chain, or if our community is not so simple, like most real communities, more likely to be a food web with lots of interconnections between different things, what eats what, stuff like that. Productivity. How much biological material is being produced at different levels of the community or ecosystem. For example, the plants or algae that we have, are they photosynthesizing a whole lot, making lots and lots of new plant growth, or not so much? How much of that's getting eaten by our herbivores? How much of the herbivores getting eaten by the carnivores? Those types of things. So these are some of the types of things that a community ecology study would be looking at. Because the species in a community are overlapping in time and space, there is some degree of competition. Are they each getting the water, the food, sunlight, things like that that they might want? Spaces to live. Lots of things that they may be competing for to some degree. Of course, competition in part relates to different roles in the ecosystem. The producers are very much competing for sunlight. that's not as big an issue for those of us who aren't photosynthesizing. Now, true, look at, say, the rocks out in the Broad River and the turtles that are practically stacked on top of each other. Sometimes they are stacked on top of each other. Obviously, the one on the top is getting the most sunshine warmed up there, but it's not quite the same level of competition for the sunshine as is happening between the plants. Consumers, of course, the primary consumers, the herbivores, are competing for the plants to eat. If a bunch of Japanese beetles come along and eat your plants, then you can't eat the garden. You can eat the beetles, but you couldn't eat the garden. So you have potential competition there at various levels. Decomposers. If the vulture eats the roadkill, then the crow doesn't get it. You're going to have competition there. But not all interactions are competition. You can have interactions where others benefit. Some species have effects on the environment that benefit others. And this is known as facilitation. One example the textbook talks about somewhat more is a particular type of plant in the genus Laricia that where it grows in mountain areas in the Rockies and the like, it tends to make conditions good for other plants as well. So plants growing near Laricia tend to do better. Another example for that would be, say, the impact of plants that have nitrogen-fixing symbionts living with them. That will enrich the soil in nitrogen compounds, which the plants need. Again, remember nitrogen, it's in all proteins and nucleic acids, so you need it. And certain bacteria have the chemical ability to grab the generally very unreactive and not useful nitrogen out of the air and react it to make stuff that can be used by living things. Those bacteria grow in association with the roots of a variety of types of plants. For example, legumes, bean family, soybeans, clover, alfalfa. These, if you grow them in your field, then you're getting the nitrogen there and your other crops will be happier. Or if they're growing wild, you have that effect. But there are several possible patterns of interaction. Competition. Two individuals competing, neither one's getting as much as they would without the competition. So both tend to be harmed by competition. Predation. If I eat a hamburger, I've gotten some nice yummy nutrients. Cow isn't so happy with this deal. I have benefited, the cow has been harmed. Symbiosis, living together, so this is a ongoing interaction rather than more limited in time for the competition or predation. Mutualism is when both the species benefit each other. And there are several examples of this. Commensalism, one's benefiting and the other doesn't matter. It's not helping, it's not hurting, it's just there. Parasitism, one species has a long-term relationship with another, which it's benefiting from, and it's harmful to the other. Now, of course, things get very complicated in assessing exactly. If one's benefiting somewhat more than the other, is that entirely mutualistic? Could there possibly be some harm or benefit happening and what looks to be going more one way or another. When you look really closely, things get kind of messy, but as broad categories that can shade into each other, it's useful to think about. Different types of species in a community have quite complex interactions often. And sometimes one thing that could happen has other implications that you might not immediately realize until you look at the whole interaction. This is a classic example, situation that we see in forests in, say, our general part of the world. A lot of trees take a strategy of not producing too many seeds for a few years, and then all of a sudden here's one year when all the trees are putting out a huge crop. Say if we're thinking about oaks, they produce loads of acorns. This is known as a mast year. Why would you do that? Well, if every year the trees are producing basically the same number of acorns, every year all the seed eaters know what to expect. They'll be ready for that many acorns and will eat an awful lot of them. But if your normal year, there's only so many acorns, and so you have only a more limited number of things like squirrels and some types of woodpecker like acorns, other small rodents, larger animals, pigs love acorns, deer, things like that. And then all of a sudden here's a year where there's acorns all over the place. Well, those acorn eaters are going to be nice and full and happy, but even that, there's still going to be lots of acorns left over because there were so many more than usual. There weren't enough things to eat them all, and a good number of those acorns are left over to grow into new trees. So that's the strategy. It's not just in plants. For example, the pattern of our long-term cicadas, the 7-year, 13-year cicada cycles, same idea. Lots of things like to eat cicadas, even people in some parts of the world. But if it's 13 years between when you get lots and lots of them, predators focusing on cicadas will be awful hungry for several years before a whole bunch comes around. So it's not practical for the predators to be ready to gobble up all the cicadas when a huge bunch come. Okay, so we've got a year, lots of acorns. We're going to have lots of mice, lots of deer. Now the mice eat other things too, as do deer. Among other things, the mice will feed on insects and can effectively eat a number of pupae of gypsy moths. This is a butterfly chrysalis, not a pupa. Somebody needs a little more entomology. Okay, gypsy moths, those are an invasive pest here in North America. Somebody brought them over from Europe with the bright idea that he thought he could cross gypsy moths with silkworms and make silk-producing caterpillars that were tougher than silkworms, easier to grow. Gypsy moths and silkworms are not all that closely related. Trying to cross them was not a real good idea unless you had genetic engineering, which you did not have back in the 1800s. And so it failed, but the gypsy moth escaped, and now they are major pests in forests. So the mice eat more of the gypsy moth pupae. Fewer gypsy moths, the trees are happier. But also, mice and deer, they may feed on other things. Deer, for example, not only eat plants, but are inclined to raid birds' nests they find. That can be a problem. Both mice and deer can be fed on by ticks. And so we got lots of deer, lots of mice. We'll tend to see more ticks. But come next year, oak trees are not producing all those acorns, and our deer and mice are more hungry. We may see some die off, not as many of them. And that bumper crop of ticks is looking for food. No deer, no mice, but here's this warm thing walking through the woods. I'll go bite it. It might be you. And so we tend to see an increase in tick-borne disease, such as Lyme disease, impacting people as a result of this sequence.